Wait, nobody called you? I was standing on my front porch holding a folder from my grandmother's attorney when I said those words. My husband David was holding divorce papers. My mother-in-law Carol stood beside him with her arms folded and a smile that looked more like a victory lap than an expression. The late afternoon sun was dropping behind the trees lining our street in Reno, Nevada. Neighbors were mowing lawns. Someone was walking a golden retriever across the road. It looked like an ordinary suburban evening. Except my husband had apparently decided to destroy my life. "The house is gone," David said. He actually looked proud of himself. "You have nowhere to go now." I looked down at the sales contract he had shoved toward me. Then I looked back at him, and I smiled. That was the moment Carol lost her patience. "Why are you smiling?" she snapped. Her voice was sharp enough to cut glass. I glanced down at the paperwork one more time. Then I repeated the question that changed everything. "Wait, nobody called you?" The confidence drained from David's face for just a second. Just a second. Then it came back. "No," he said. "Who would call me?" I tucked the folder under my arm. Interesting. And for the first time all afternoon I realized that maybe my grandmother had known exactly what she was doing. But to understand why that moment mattered, you have to understand how I got there. My name is Linda Parker. I was 63 years old. For nearly 40 years I had been married to the same man. At least I thought I knew him. Most people would have described me as dependable. I spent 28 years working as a school administrator. I volunteered at church. I remembered birthdays. I baked casseroles when neighbors were sick. I was the person everyone called when they needed help. My grandmother used to say that some people spend their lives building things, while others spend their lives taking things. Back then I thought she was being cynical. Now I know she was simply paying attention. David and I met when we were both in our 20s. He was charming, funny, the kind of man who could make an entire room laugh. When we were young, his confidence felt attractive. As the years passed, I learned confidence and entitlement can look very similar. Still, we built a life together. Or at least I thought we did. When David's construction business struggled during the recession, I worked extra hours. When he wanted to invest in a friend's startup idea, I supported him. When he made expensive mistakes, I helped clean them up. Marriage is supposed to be a partnership. At least that's what I believed. David's mother never agreed. Carol had disliked me almost from the beginning. I wasn't from a wealthy family. I wasn't glamorous. And I wasn't willing to spend my life worshipping her son. Over the decades, she made her opinions known. Some comments were subtle. Most weren't. Whenever something good happened to me, Carol found a way to diminish it. Whenever something bad happened, she somehow made it my fault. I learned to tolerate it. What I didn't realize was that David had started listening to her. The last few years of our marriage felt different. David became secretive, distracted, always on his phone, always talking about money, always talking about what other people had. Bigger homes, newer cars, vacation properties. Meanwhile, I was thinking about retirement, about gardening, about spending time with family, about finally slowing down after decades of work. My grandmother Eleanor understood that. She was 92 when she passed away, sharp as a tack right until the end. She had lived through wars, recessions, and more family drama than most television writers could invent. Grandma Eleanor had a gift for seeing people clearly, especially when they thought nobody was watching. 3 weeks before everything fell apart, I sat beside her hospital bed. She squeezed my hand. "You always take care of everybody else," she said. I smiled. "Somebody has to." "No." Her grip tightened. "Somebody has to take care of you too." At the time, I thought she was talking about my health. Or retirement. Or grief. I didn't realize she was talking about what was coming. The funeral was simple, beautiful, the kind of service she would have wanted. Family shared stories. Friends cried. The pastor talked about kindness and resilience. I remember looking around the room and feeling grateful that I had known her. A week later, her attorney called. "Mrs. Parker, we'd like you to attend the reading of your grandmother's will." That wasn't unusual. Grandma had always been organized. I expected a few keepsakes. Maybe some family photographs. Possibly a modest inheritance. Nothing more. Certainly nothing that could change my life. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday morning. David didn't come. He claimed he had appointments. Carol somehow knew about the meeting anyway. "Don't get your hopes up," she told me over the phone. "Older people usually spend everything before they die." I remember laughing. Not because it was funny, because it was predictable. The attorney's office overlooked the Truckee River. The waiting room smelled like coffee and leather furniture. I arrived 10 minutes early. My hands were shaking slightly. Not because I expected money, because I missed my grandmother. I would have traded every dollar she owned for one more conversation, one more Sunday afternoon, one more story. The attorney eventually invited me into a conference room. A thick folder sat on the table. Several documents were arranged neatly beside it. Something about the attorney's expression immediately caught my attention. He looked prepared, careful, almost cautious. "Mrs. Parker," he said, "your grandmother left very specific instructions." I nodded. Then he opened the file. And within the next hour, I learned something that would change my entire future. I had absolutely no idea that David was already planning to destroy my marriage before I made it home. The attorney didn't rush. That was the first thing I noticed. Most lawyers move quickly. They explain documents, point to signatures, and get on with their day. This man seemed determined to make sure I understood every single word. "Your grandmother was very thorough," he said. "I'll say." He smiled slightly. "That's one way to put it." For the next hour, he walked me through document after document. At first, it felt surreal. I inherited several investment accounts that had quietly grown over decades. There were bonds, retirement funds, stocks, property interests. The total was far more money than I had ever imagined possessing. I sat there staring at the figures while trying to process what I was hearing. Then came the Lake Tahoe estate. That was the moment I nearly stopped breathing. The property had been in our family for generations. A beautiful lakefront home with towering pines and a private dock. I spent summers there as a child. I learned to swim in that lake. I caught my first fish there with my grandfather. The house wasn't just valuable. It was home. The attorney slid photographs across the table. Recent appraisal reports, property records, tax documents. Everything had been meticulously organized. My grandmother had left the entire estate to me. Not shared, not divided. Mine. Tears filled my eyes. Not because of the value. Because she trusted me with something that mattered so much to her. "I wish she were here," I whispered. The attorney nodded. "She talked about you often." That made me smile. Then his expression changed. It became more serious, more cautious. He opened another folder. "There's something else." Inside was a letter written entirely in my grandmother's handwriting. I recognized it immediately. The loops. The careful penmanship. The way she always crossed her T's. My throat tightened. The attorney gave me a moment before continuing. "Mrs. Parker, your grandmother instructed us to provide this only after her passing." I unfolded the letter. The first line made my stomach drop. "Linda, if you're reading this, then I'm gone. More importantly, I suspect certain people are about to show you exactly who they are." I stared at the page. My grandmother knew me well enough that she had my full attention immediately. The letter continued. She wrote about trust, about family, about how money doesn't change people, it reveals them. Then came a sentence I couldn't stop thinking about. "I've watched David more carefully than he realizes." My eyes narrowed. The attorney quietly looked away, as though he had already read every word. Grandma described incidents I barely remembered. Comments David had made. Arguments involving money. Moments when she noticed his priorities shifting. She never accused him of being evil. She simply observed. And my grandmother was terrifyingly observant. Toward the end of the letter she wrote, "If I'm wrong about him, wonderful. If I'm right, you'll understand these documents soon enough." I looked up. "What documents?" The attorney opened another folder. Inside were trust agreements, ownership structures, transfer instructions, complex legal paperwork that made my head spin. He spent nearly 30 minutes explaining everything. Some of it I understood immediately. Some of it required clarification. But one thing became clear. My grandmother had protected her assets carefully. Very carefully. Especially the Lake Tahoe property. By the time I left the office, my emotions were all over the place. Grief. Gratitude. Confusion. Relief. I wanted to talk to someone. I wanted to tell David everything. Despite our recent problems, he was still my husband. Or so I thought. As I drove home, I imagined his reaction. Maybe we'd finally have some breathing room. Maybe retirement wouldn't feel so uncertain. Maybe we could repair some of the distance that had grown between us. I even stopped to buy a bottle of wine. Nothing extravagant. Just something nice enough to mark the occasion. Looking back now, that part almost makes me laugh. Because while I was driving home imagining celebration, David was planning an execution. I didn't know it then. But he had spent weeks preparing. Months, perhaps. The divorce papers weren't a sudden decision. The house sale wasn't impulsive. Everything had been carefully arranged. And Carol had helped every step of the way. I learned later that the two of them had met with a realtor several times. They had discussed finances, property values, settlement strategies, even living arrangements after the divorce. Apparently, they were so confident that they had already started talking about renovations. Renovations. To a life they assumed they had successfully stolen. When I finally turned onto our street, I immediately sensed something was wrong. 2 unfamiliar vehicles were parked near the curb. David's truck sat in the driveway. Carol's Cadillac was parked beside it. The bottle of wine rested on the passenger seat. The folder from the attorney sat beside me. For a brief moment, I almost stayed in the car. Just a feeling. A strange feeling. Like standing outside before a storm. Then I grabbed the folder and walked toward the house. David and Carol were already waiting. Not inside. Outside. Like they wanted an audience. Like they wanted to witness my reaction. The moment I saw the papers in David's hand, my stomach dropped. "What's going on?" His answer came instantly. "I'm filing for divorce." No hesitation. No emotion. No explanation. Just the sentence. 40 years together. Reduced to 5 words. Carol looked almost excited. I remember that detail clearly. She looked happier than I had seen her in years. Then David handed me the documents. "The house has already been sold." I blinked. "What?" "The sale closed this morning." He smiled. Not kindly. Triumphantly. "You'll need somewhere else to stay." For several seconds I couldn't even process what I was hearing. This was my life. My marriage. My home. And they were talking about it like a business transaction. Then David delivered the line he clearly had rehearsed. "You have nowhere to go now." I looked down at the paperwork. The sales contract. The property records. The signatures. At first I felt shock. Then confusion. Then something else. Something unexpected. I noticed a name. A date. A document reference. My grandmother's attorney had spent 30 minutes explaining it just a few hours earlier. Suddenly everything clicked. I couldn't stop myself. I smiled. Carol's face twisted with irritation. "Why are you smiling?" she snapped. I looked at the contract again, then at David, and for the first time all day I realized they had made a very serious mistake. A mistake so large that neither of them even knew it yet. I tilted my head. "Wait." David frowned. "Wait, what?" I folded the paperwork and handed it back. Then I asked the question that instantly changed the expression on his face. "Wait, nobody called you." For the first time that afternoon, David looked uncertain, just for a moment. Then he laughed, a short, dismissive laugh. "What are you talking about?" Carol folded her arms tighter. "She's bluffing." I looked from one to the other. It amazed me how confident they still were. The confidence of people who had never bothered to check whether they were actually right. I handed the sales contract back to David. "You should answer your phone." His smile faded. "My phone is fine." As if on cue, it rang. The timing was almost comical. David glanced at the screen. "Unknown number." He declined the call. 30 seconds later, it rang again. "Same number." He declined it again. Carol rolled her eyes. "Debt collectors already." I didn't say anything. I simply stood there holding my grandmother's folder. The phone rang a third time. This time David answered. "What?" The change in his expression happened slowly. First irritation, then confusion, then concern. The color began draining from his face. I couldn't hear the voice on the other end. But I didn't need to. I already knew. The attorney had explained exactly what would happen. David listened for nearly a minute. Then he looked at me, not with anger, with uncertainty. Real uncertainty. "What do you mean ownership changed?" Carol immediately stepped closer. "What are they talking about?" David held up a finger, still listening. Then he said the words that told me everything. "That's impossible." The call ended. Silence settled over the porch. Carol looked impatient. "Well," David swallowed. "The title company says there's a problem." I nodded. "That's what I thought." Carol stared at me. "What problem?" I took a slow breath. For 40 years I had been the person who fixed David's mistakes. The person who explained things. The person who made excuses for him. For the first time in my life I decided not to do that. "If you want details," I said, "you should probably talk to your attorney." Then I walked inside. Behind me, Carol started demanding answers. David didn't follow. For once he didn't seem to know what to do. That evening was the quietest evening our house had experienced in years. David stayed in his office making phone calls. Carol eventually left. The bottle of wine I bought remained unopened on the kitchen counter. I sat alone at the dining table and reread my grandmother's letter. The sentence that stayed with me was simple. People reveal themselves when they think they've already won. I finally understood what she meant. Around 9 o'clock, David appeared in the doorway. He looked exhausted. Older, smaller somehow. What did your grandmother do? I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because that was the wrong question. She didn't do anything. Then why is the sale being challenged? I looked directly at him. Did you read the ownership documents? His silence answered for him. No, I said softly. You didn't. He sat down. For the first time all day, his confidence had disappeared. What happened? I studied him. The man across from me had been my husband for 4 decades. I knew his habits, his expressions, his weaknesses, and one weakness had followed him his entire life. He never read the fine print. Not on contracts, not on investments, not on anything. He always assumed things would work out, or that someone else would fix the consequences. Usually me. A memory suddenly surfaced. About 8 years earlier, David invested nearly $50,000 into a friend's business venture. He never reviewed the documents, never researched the company, never asked questions. 6 months later, the money was gone. I had spent years helping recover financially from that decision. Now he had made the same mistake again. Only this time I wasn't planning to rescue him. The next morning I met with my grandmother's attorney. His office overlooked the river just as peacefully as it had the day before. The difference was that now I understood why he had seemed so cautious. You anticipated this, didn't you? I asked. The attorney smiled carefully. Your grandmother anticipated many possibilities. He slid several documents across the desk. Mrs. Parker Eleanor was concerned. About David? He nodded. Very much so. Apparently my grandmother had spent years restructuring portions of her estate. Not because she expected a legal battle. Because she expected greed. She had witnessed small incidents, conversations, comments, patterns. Nothing dramatic, just enough to make her uneasy. Several years earlier, she established a trust structure that would activate immediately upon her death. One section involved the Lake Tahoe estate. Another involved associated property interests. The details were complicated, but the result was simple. The house David thought he sold wasn't legally positioned the way he assumed. Certain ownership interests changed the moment my grandmother passed away. Changes that became effective before the sale paperwork was finalized. Changes the title company eventually discovered. Changes David never bothered to investigate. When I left the attorney's office, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Not revenge. Not satisfaction. Peace. For years, I carried the responsibility of protecting everyone around me. Now I realized something. Sometimes the truth protects itself. Over the next several days, events accelerated. The real estate broker called repeatedly. The title company requested additional documents. Attorneys became involved. The buyers grew nervous. Questions multiplied. Meanwhile, David spent nearly every waking hour on the phone. I could see the stress wearing him down. He wasn't sleeping. He wasn't eating much. His confidence had vanished completely. One afternoon, I returned from grocery shopping and found him sitting alone on the back patio. He looked defeated. The way people look when reality finally catches them. I didn't know, he said quietly. I set the grocery bags down. I know. He stared at the yard. I thought... His voice faded. You thought what? He looked away. I thought everything belonged to us. There it was. The truth. Not you. Not our marriage. Not our future. The assets. The money. The property. That was what mattered. I suddenly understood something my grandmother had recognized years before I did. David loved security. He loved comfort. He loved ownership. But somewhere along the way, he stopped valuing loyalty. That realization hurt more than the divorce papers. A few days later, the next call arrived. The one that changed everything. David answered in the living room. I watched from the kitchen. Within seconds, all the color disappeared from his face. His hand started shaking. When he hung up, he didn't move. Didn't speak. Didn't even blink. Finally, he looked at me. And for the first time since our marriage began falling apart, I saw genuine fear. Not fear of losing money. Fear of consequences. Real consequences. And somehow I knew the worst part was still coming. Fear looks different on different people. Some cry. Some get angry. Some pretend everything is still under control. David became quiet. Dangerously quiet. The phone call that drained the color from his face had come from the attorney representing the buyers. Not the broker. Not the title company. The buyers themselves had hired legal counsel. And they were asking questions nobody wanted to answer. For nearly a week, our house felt like a waiting room. David spent his days making calls, receiving calls, reading documents he should have read months earlier. At night I could hear him pacing downstairs, opening and closing kitchen cabinets, walking from room to room, unable to sit still. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years I had been the one lying awake worrying about bills, retirement, medical expenses, and the future. David always slept soundly. Now our roles had reversed. One afternoon I found him sitting at the dining room table surrounded by paperwork. Stacks of it. Contracts, property records, emails, legal notices. The same man who once signed documents without reading them was now studying every line like his life depended on it. Maybe it did. He looked up when I entered. "Can we talk?" I considered saying no, but after 40 years together, some habits are hard to break. I sat down. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, David cleared his throat. "The buyers are threatening legal action." I nodded. "I know." His eyes narrowed. "How do you know?" My attorney called. The word attorney seemed to bother him, probably because he finally realized I wasn't navigating this alone. For decades, David assumed I would simply adapt to whatever situation he created. This time, professionals were involved. Real professionals. The kind who dealt in facts instead of assumptions. "The title company suspended everything," he said. "I know." "The broker is furious." "I know." He leaned back in his chair. For the first time in our marriage, he looked uncertain about every answer. And oddly enough, that made me sad. Not satisfied? Sad. Because I remembered the young man I married. The one who dreamed big. The one who made me laugh. The one who wasn't obsessed with money. Somewhere over the years, that man had disappeared. And neither of us noticed when it happened. Or maybe I noticed and chose not to admit it. A few days later, Carol arrived unexpectedly. The moment I opened the door, I could tell something had changed. She looked tired. Not physically. Emotionally. Like someone who had spent days discovering that reality didn't match the story she'd been telling herself. "I need to speak with David." I stepped aside. She entered without another word. From the kitchen, I could hear them arguing. Not discussing. Arguing. The kind of argument that happens when blame starts looking for a place to land. "You told me it was handled." "I thought it was." "You thought." I trusted the paperwork. "You didn't read it." Neither of them realized I could hear every word. Eventually, the voices grew quieter. Then silence. When Carol finally emerged, she looked older than she had a week earlier. She paused near the front door. For a moment, it seemed like she wanted to say something. Instead, she simply left. That night, David sat across from me in the living room. No television. No phones. Just silence. Then he said something I never expected. "This is my fault." I looked up. Yes. No argument. No defensiveness. No excuses. Just honesty. The honesty should have come years earlier. But it was still honesty. He stared at the floor. I kept listening to people who told me what I wanted to hear. I thought about Carol. The broker. Various friends who always had investment opportunities. People who fed his ego. People who convinced him he deserved more. Meanwhile, the person who actually stood beside him for 40 years became invisible. "I thought I was being smart," he admitted. I didn't respond, because there wasn't much left to say. A week later, the legal situation finally reached its conclusion. The attorneys gathered everyone together. Buyers. Broker. Representatives. Documents covered the conference table. For hours, people reviewed records and timelines. The facts were surprisingly simple. The assumptions had been complicated. The trust structure my grandmother established years earlier created ownership issues that David never investigated. The transaction could not proceed as originally planned. Corrections had to be made. Agreements had to be revised. Money had to be returned. Expensive mistakes had consequences. When the meeting ended, the broker looked exhausted. The buyers looked frustrated. David looked defeated. And I felt something unexpected. Relief. Not because he suffered. Because the uncertainty was finally over. Outside the building, David stopped me before I reached my car. "Linda." I turned. His eyes were red. Not dramatically. Just enough to tell me he hadn't been sleeping. "I owe you an apology." I waited. For years, I had listened to partial apologies. Conditional apologies. Apologies with explanations attached. This felt different. "I took you for granted." The words came slowly. Painfully. "I assumed you'd always be there." I remained silent. "I thought your kindness meant weakness." That one hurt. Because it was true. Not that I was weak. That he believed I was. For decades. He shook his head. I didn't appreciate what I had. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Traffic moved through the parking lot. A breeze stirred nearby trees. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary life. Yet somehow everything felt different. I can't change what I did, David said. No, I know. His voice cracked slightly. But if I could, he stopped. I could see genuine regret. Not regret for losing money. Not regret for getting caught. Regret for hurting someone who loved him. There is a difference. And after 40 years, I knew how to recognize it. I took a slow breath. I'm not ready to answer today. He nodded immediately. I understand. And surprisingly, I think he did. As I drove home, I realized something important. The revenge I imagined years earlier during arguments, disappointments, and sleepless nights never actually happened. I didn't destroy David. I didn't humiliate him. I didn't seek vengeance. The truth simply arrived. And once it did, everything else followed naturally. The hardest part wasn't watching him fall. The hardest part was deciding what to do after he did. 3 months later, I was standing on the deck of the Lake Tahoe estate watching the sun rise over the water. The lake was perfectly still. A thin layer of morning mist floated across the surface. Pine trees surrounded the property exactly as they had when I was a little girl. For the first time in years, I felt calm. Not happy. Not triumphant. Calm. People often imagine that revenge feels exciting. That when someone who hurt you finally faces consequences, you'll feel powerful. What I learned is that peace feels much better than revenge. Peace lets you sleep. Peace lets you breathe. Peace lets you move forward. The legal issues had finally been resolved. The buyers received their money back. The contracts were corrected. The trust structure my grandmother created worked exactly as intended. Every professional involved agreed on one thing. Most of the disaster could have been avoided if people had simply read the documents carefully and communicated honestly. My grandmother would have appreciated that irony. She always believed most family conflicts started long before the explosion. They started with small acts of selfishness. Small lies, small assumptions. Over time, those small things became large enough to destroy trust. I thought about that often, especially while settling into my new life. The Lake Tahoe estate wasn't just a house. It became a fresh start. I renovated a few rooms. Nothing extravagant. Just enough to make it feel like my own. I planted flowers near the front walkway. I joined a local volunteer organization. I started spending more time with old friends I hadn't seen regularly in years. For the first time since retirement, my life belonged entirely to me. No crisis management. No rescuing someone from their own mistakes. No pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. Just honesty. And surprisingly, honesty felt lighter than denial. David, meanwhile, was learning lessons of his own. The first few weeks after everything collapsed were difficult for him. Several people he considered close friends disappeared almost immediately. The broker stopped returning calls. Certain relatives who had encouraged his decisions suddenly became unavailable. Reality has a way of exposing who truly belongs in your corner. One afternoon, about 4 months after the divorce proceedings began, David called. I almost didn't answer. Almost. But 40 years creates complicated emotions. Hello. There was a pause. Then his voice. Linda. Yes. I was wondering if you'd be willing to have coffee. Not dinner. Not reconciliation. Not a dramatic speech. Just coffee. I thought about it. Then I said yes. A week later, we met at a small coffee shop overlooking the lake. The kind of place where retired couples sit for hours talking about grandchildren and fishing trips. David looked different. Not physically. Emotionally. The arrogance was gone. The certainty was gone. The constant need to prove something was gone. For the first time in years, he looked like himself. Or perhaps the version of himself I had originally fallen in love with. We talked for nearly 2 hours. Not about lawyers. Not about money. Not about property. About life. About mistakes. About growing older. About regret. Eventually, David looked down at his coffee cup. I've replayed everything 1,000 times. I didn't respond. I keep asking myself how I became that person. The sadness in his voice felt genuine. And strangely enough, I believed him. Not because he deserved automatic forgiveness. Because people are capable of change when they finally stop lying to themselves. I hurt you, he said quietly. Yes, I know. His eyes filled with tears, not dramatic tears. The kind older people understand. The kind that come from carrying regret too long. I don't expect you to fix this. That sentence mattered. Because for the first time, he wasn't asking me to solve his problem. He was accepting responsibility for it. A few weeks later, Carol surprised me even more. She called and asked if she could visit. I nearly declined. But curiosity won. When she arrived, she looked nervous. I had never seen Carol nervous, not once in 40 years. She sat across from me on the deck overlooking the lake. For several minutes she struggled to find words. Then she finally said something I never expected to hear. I was wrong. Just 3 words. Simple. Powerful. Honest. She admitted she spent years treating me unfairly. She admitted she encouraged David's worst instincts. She admitted her own pride had damaged relationships she should have protected. The conversation didn't erase decades of pain. Some wounds leave scars. But scars aren't the same as open injuries. By the time she left, something had changed. Not perfection. Not complete healing. But progress. And sometimes progress is enough. Today, nearly a year after that terrible afternoon on my front porch, I can look back without anger. The truth is, my grandmother gave me much more than money. Much more than property. Much more than financial security. She gave me clarity. She taught me that character matters more than circumstances. That kindness should never be confused with weakness. That protecting yourself is not the same as being selfish. And perhaps most importantly, she reminded me that people eventually reveal who they are. The question is whether we're willing to see it. If there's one lesson I hope others take from my story, it's this. Never sign documents you don't understand. Never assume someone else's version of the truth is the whole truth. And never underestimate the value of honest communication before problems become disasters. Money doesn't create character. It reveals it. Success doesn't create integrity. It reveals it. And sometimes life's greatest inheritance isn't wealth at all. It's wisdom. If this story touched you, reminded you of someone, or made you reflect on your own life, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your experience in the comments, pass this story along to someone who might need it, and subscribe for more stories about resilience, family, second chances, and the lessons we learn along the way. Thank you for spending this time with me. The end.